You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything, conversations with the icons of our time.
We assumed bravely we'd be held for a few hours, they'd make their case, and they'd leave and turn it back to us. We didn't appreciate that it would be 444 days.
Former Iranian hostage Bruce Laingen. Today on Now I've Heard Everything, I'm Bill Thompson. Bruce Laingen was charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in November 1979, when a band of Iranian students and other militants stormed the embassy, took it over, and took 52 people hostage, including Bruce Laingen.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States, where he's receiving medical treatment for cancer.
They were held captive for the next 444 days. Diplomatic efforts to free them failed. A military rescue effort engineered by President Carter failed.
2 of our American aircraft collided on the ground following a refueling operation in a remote desert location in Iran. To my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed.
Ultimately, the hostages were released only when Jimmy Carter was leaving office, literally as Ronald Reagan was taking the oath of office that day. Reagan himself made the announcement just a couple of hours later.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
Years later, Bruce Laingen wrote a book about his experience based on a journal he'd kept once it became apparent to him that his captivity might last a while. In a moment, my conversation with Bruce Laingen.
Have you ever opened a time capsule? You're about to. This interview is from national radio personality Bill Thompson's 30-year interview archive. Enjoy.
So here now from 1992, Bruce Laingen.
I was able to write a great deal sitting there. I had a lot of time. And in my case, I had a little more freedom than the others, and I was able to get things out. In the first month, of course, or the first few weeks, no, I didn't think I was going to write a journal and that I would be there 444 days. No, I hoped to God I would be free the next day. We sort of lived on that kind of hope. Eventually it stretched out, and we realized it would take some time, and I thought, I better get this down on paper to the extent I can, because I'd like to remember it, and my family should remember it, and maybe there would be an interest somewhere.
A few weeks ago, Major Rhonda Cornum was here. She was one of the POWs in Iraq.
Yes, indeed.
And she said that the tough part about being a prisoner is, 1, you don't know if you're going to be killed, and number 2, you don't know how long it's going to last.
That's correct.
Those must have been your sentiments as well.
Well, we certainly didn't know how long it was going to last. In her case, she had much more reason to fear death than I did, although even in Tehran, there was the risk of passion getting out of hand. I say that, however, believing that the Iranian students and the government that was in place at the time didn't want to kill us. They didn't want dead hostages. They were of no use to them. Live hostages, as pawns in their political process, were very useful.
I've always wondered about something. Was it just coincidence that they took over the embassy 1 year before our presidential election, or was that just a coincidence?
No, that had nothing to do with the elections. It was a time when the more radical elements of the revolution, already in place by that time, 8 months, began to worry about a drift of the revolution back into a relationship with the great Satan, the United States. And they wanted to arrest that, the radical elements did. And they saw the admission of the Shah into the United States as a peg on which they could act and fire the passions of the streets and take over control of that revolution in a more radical direction. They succeeded, and it's in place still today.
It is poignant, given the fact we already know how the story comes out, to read from front to back and see your mood as it changes over the weeks and over the months.
Changed a lot.
Changed a great deal. And again, like I said, we can read it with the knowledge that we know you got out safely.
It was a roller coaster experience because our emotions were up and down a great deal. We lived on hope, and those hopes were more often than not dashed. But in the long run, that hope succeeded, the faith we had in our country and in ourselves. I emphasize that because we learned a lot about ourselves as hostages. You've got a lot of time to think about that. I called it yellow ribbon because that was a symbol that was used here in the United States to demonstrate unity, caring, a conviction that it would work out. And, of course, I called it yellow ribbon not least because my wife began that tradition. She hung up the first yellow ribbon, and it took off.
Knowing that you've got somebody back home must help a great deal.
Oh, indeed. It's one of the strengths that always came back, reaffirmed strength that we came back with. That is the utility, the importance, the help of family connections. Whatever it is. Or friends, close friends. They help a lot, knowing someone back there is thinking about you.
It's easy for civilians who don't know how the government bureaucracy works to say, all right, they've been hostages for 5 days, 6 days now. Let's just go in and get them out and bring them home. You being a member of the government, you know how the wheels of bureaucracy can move and turn with aching slowness at times. Did you anticipate that this was going to take more than just a few days?
No, of course not. The embassy had been seized once before at the beginning of the revolution and held for about 6 hours by essentially the same kind of people that took us later. Having seen that, known that, we knew we had that kind of risk facing us as an embassy in Tehran. But having been attacked the second time, we assumed bravely that it would again be something like the earlier assault. We'd be held for a few hours, they'd make their case, and they'd leave and turn back to us. We didn't appreciate that it would be 444 days until the 443rd day, I suppose.
Wow. And it is also poignant to read and hear the bits of news that you get from time to time throughout the whole 440. As you hear about the failed rescue attempt, the dead soldiers in the desert, when you hear about the results of the presidential election, all part of the roller coaster, I would imagine.
Indeed. Of course, I had a unique opportunity as a hostage to be half free and half hostage. I knew a lot that was going on in the United States. I knew something of what was going on in Tehran. I knew the condition of some of my hostage colleagues, at least. In that sense, I guess I had an opportunity to put something down that is a little unique in a hostage experience, because it isn't all about how I felt this day and how I felt that day. It's a book also about how I judged the evolution of policy affecting this crisis.
Were you, looking back on it now with the hindsight that a number of years provides, are you satisfied with the responses that our government made?
One can never be satisfied that anyone or any group of 53 and more were held hostage. No, I'm not satisfied with that. But given the options that the Carter administration had. Given the options that Carter had, I don't think he had many alternatives to do other than what he essentially did, to wait it out, to try through diplomatic persuasion to pressure by sanctions. The threat evident in the hostage rescue attempt, even if it didn't work, that Carter might damn well use some force, particularly if any of the hostages were hurt. Force is not an easy method to apply in a hostage situation. We saw that in spades in Beirut. All of that agony, much closer to us, right offshore, the Sixth Fleet, and yet we couldn't wait in there and find them. That's not an easy option. I think Reagan found that out painfully as well. But in terms of satisfaction, no. If I have dissatisfaction, it is with respect to policy affecting our relations with Iran, going far back into earlier administrations, not simply Carter, going way back into the administration of Franklin Roosevelt after World War II. We got onto a track in terms of a relationship with the Shah that saw us eventually blinded by conventional wisdom and not sufficiently challenging, recognizing the way in which sentiment was building up in that country that the Ayatollah Khomeini exploited so effectively and turned the mass of people against the Shah and against the West.
Again, also given the 20/20 nature of hindsight, should you and the rest of the embassy personnel been moved out of there many weeks or months before?
Probably. I have a colleague who is on record as having said before the Shah was admitted, that if we ever admitted the Shah in the context of the heat of the revolution, we should restrict the embassy to one person and a dog. Well, he was right, I suppose. Ideally, after the Shah had been admitted, we should have cut back sharply. But we were acting on the basis of what we knew. There was a favorable trend underway in our relationship with the provisional government of the revolution. Things were going right up to 3 days before the embassy was seized in terms of the cooperation we had from that government. We failed, obviously, to realize that the provisional government didn't really have power, that the power was behind the scenes, that we didn't reach in the hands of the Revolutionary Council, and not least, of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was convinced to his dying day that Iran should never again have any kind of relationship with the United States.
The great Satan. How can you be sure that you're being released when they come to you and they say, your freedom is at hand, pack your bags, you're ready to go? How do you know it's for real?
You never know. You're always, by that point in time, in our case, we were skeptical up to the last minute. The security officer who was held with me from the embassy kept warning me, look, when we get on a bus and they say we're going to the airport, don't believe it. There will be plenty of opportunities for those opposed to the settlement to frustrate that, because there were many of the radical elements who were not yet prepared to see us released. Now, we weren't prepared to accept it until we were pushed off a bus, the blindfolds were ripped off our heads, and we raced through a gauntlet of screaming Iranian terrorists as we headed for that ramp, visible in front of us in the dark of night, at the top of which step stood light, and stood as well the Swiss ambassador in Tehran, who was recording carefully every entry so that he would be sure that he had 52 hostages to return.
And I'm sure you've seen the videotape by now many, probably hundreds of times, of then just nicely President Reagan telling the people at this banquet that he's just received word that the plane has cleared Iranian airspace. What a moment we will never forget.
That was a poignant moment, not least, of course, for Jimmy Carter. Well, I don't think any of us can ever appreciate how he must have felt in those last minutes of his administration, the way in which this issue had burdened his administration, and I think it's fair to say had undermined substantially his opportunity for re-election.
Did it destroy his chances for re-election?
I don't know that it alone destroyed it, but it certainly contributed to the judgment of the American people that Carter hadn't handled things right.
Poor man, it aged him something terrible.
Yes, I'm sure it did.
Well, as I'm sure it did many of you as well. I mean, not to take anything at all away from
Bill,
those of you who had to live through it.
We came out of it, we're alive and well, and we came back, of course, to this remarkable reception that we had. None of us could have appreciated sitting there in Tehran how the American people were reaching out to us in every conceivable way, bells and church bells and yellow ribbons and prayers. We had more prayers per capita than any other group of Americans in history. That helped a great deal. Yeah, sure, some of us were bitter and unhappy, and we all came back thinner than we'd ever been before, in better physical shape, if you will, because we'd been able to had to keep our weight down. But whatever bitterness that we had, I think was largely overcome by that way in which a national reception eased our transition into normal lives again.
Have we as a nation learned anything from your experience?
I don't know. I think individual Americans, as hostages, learned a lot about themselves. That we certainly had an opportunity to do, where our strengths come from, that we've got a lot more in us than we ever appreciate until a stressful situation of this kind comes. I think we have learned something as a government in terms of coping with terrorism, the threat of terrorism. We certainly are much more security conscious in our embassies overseas than we ever were before, regrettably in a sense, because we can no longer reach out in quite the ways we did in some countries. I think fundamentally, I hope that we learned from the Iranian experience, and it's very hard to judge that because it depends on the individual case, how important it is always in foreign policy to challenge conventional wisdom, to examine all of the time the roots of your policy and make sure they're still intact. We get caught up sometimes in success and what we think is working right and forget to examine that conventional wisdom. We did that tragically with respect to the Shah in the years leading up to that crisis, and particularly in the 1 year leading up to the fall of the Shah in February 1979.
May I ask, I'm sure you've been pelted with this question many times as well, do you give any credence to the persistent reports that Reagan and his team did something in the closing days of the election to prevent you from being released?
And that's the so-called October surprise, that the Carter administration would pull a surprise in October, and that October surprise concern allegedly motivated Republicans in the Reagan camp to sign on to a deal with the Iranians to hold us hostage longer. I have not myself seen sufficient evidence to make it credible to me. Having said that, I have enormous respect for Gary Sick and his book and his investigations into this. And I've told him myself that I don't have that confidence that he has. I guess I also react the way I do because I think I'm still the kind of person who's prepared to believe that no American in important responsibility position here would ever deign to keep Americans hostage longer for political reasons. I also am skeptical that Bill Casey, however crafty he could be on occasion, would run the risk in the middle of an election campaign in leaky Washington of signing on to a deal that, if it had gone public, would have destroyed the Republican chances.
Bruce Laingen was 96 when he died in 2019. Now you can get your copy of Yellow Ribbon, the book by Bruce Laingen, by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also hear my 1990 interview with former U.S. Army General James Dozier, who was once taken hostage in Italy.
As a result of the momentum built up in the wake of my rescue, the Italian government was able to break the back of the Red Brigades and show the world that, by golly, an urban terrorist organization could be successfully dealt with.
And my 1991 conversation with another man with a connection with Iran, the man at the heart of the Iran-Contra scandal, Oliver North.
That book is much more than simply my belief that Ronald Reagan knew. I still believe Ronald Reagan knew and approved of what I did. I honestly believe that he has forgotten a good bit of what he knew.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, the attorney who's represented defendants in many high-profile cases, my 2004 conversation with Alan Dershowitz.
Often, it's only the jury you can count on to be entirely and completely objective, not always. But I'm a fan of juries, and I think juries are fairer than judges in the long run.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.